as I was preparing for my final weeks here, I decided to look for a sermon that I did here that it meant a lot and re-preach it. And in the process, looking through my files to find one, I came across the keynote address that I gave on behalf of the church at the 2018 Martin Luther King Community Practice. Since it meant a lot to me and our justice work together, I've never preached it here. I decided to shorten it a little and preach on it on our last Martin Luther King weekend together. Here goes. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King held up truth and love lenses to show us the problem of racism, hold us accountable, and give us hope as he showed us the way out. And unfiltered, those lenses point to one answer for racial reconciliation. All of us walking together toward equality for all. And he held up the truth and the love lenses and asked, why is equality so assiduously avoided? Why does white America delude itself? And how does it rationalize the evil it retains? And the answer Dr. King gave still applies. The majority of white Americans, he wrote, consider themselves sincerely committed to justice for the Negro. They believe that American society is essentially hospitable to fair play and a steady growth toward a middle-class utopia embodying racial harmony. But unfortunately, this is a fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity. Dr. King. One of Martin Luther King's greatest accomplishments is that the vast majority of Americans now claim that racism is terrible and that equality is good. And that wasn't true before he began his work. And most Americans today will also claim they want justice for African Americans. But the fantasy of self-deception continues. We deceive ourselves by putting filters on the truth and love lenses, creating soft, diffused, and false perceptions. Many white conversations on racism don't address the complicity, complacency, and hard-heartedness and pure evil of racism head on. We filter truth and love with terms that split racism up and give it parts, gentle names. We name those with exclusive access to God-given rights privilege. We name petulant resistance to others having that access fragility. And we try to depersonalize involvement in racism by hearing the labeling of racism as systemic, as allowing us to distance or dismiss ourselves from involvement and taking action against an entire system. Racism is certainly a vicious, widespread virus in our culture systems, and we must not make the mistake of thinking we only have to act nice as individuals and racism will die. But we also must not make the mistake of thinking systemic racism means racism is beyond our responsibility or too big to face or stop. Racism is a white-created, controlled, and continuing evil hurting all of us, but especially hurting non-whites. We must be careful not to dismiss or distance ourselves from systemic racism by thinking we are not a part of the system, not a part of the problem, not a part of the solution. Many white discussions about racism use academic terminology inappropriately as filters to the point we don't focus on its wickedness, so that white people discussing racism are haunted by their complicity and complacency with the evil of racism in America. We end up filtering racism with niceties, but not one bit of racism is nice or distant or dismissible. It is a horrible, thriving evil. Or perhaps the worst part of the lenses we hold over Dr. King's, the filters we hold over Dr. King's lenses, is that they misdirect attention from the pressing horrors of what the lack of equal access to rights means for non-whites. Racism means oppression, or the threat of it, in every area of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Racism means inequality in dealing with authorities, employment, businesses, housing, schools, medicine, economics, and justice. Racism means mistreatment by whites, being uncaring or rude or violent in every imaginable location of our lives, our streets, our schools, parks, businesses, airways, workplaces, political bodies, and justice systems. Racism means deep harms to many Americans. It means generations deprived of opportunities and economic legacies and inflicted with injustices and traumas that whites with rights have caused and allowed to exist. By labeling white benefactors of racism privilege and a petulance, fragility, and racism systemic, we created a means to deceitfully soften and diffuse the reality of racism, creating excuses and confusion that can cause whites to say, I'm not privileged, I'm not fragile, I can't do anything about the system. You see, sadly, we still play to the fantasy of self-deception and comfortable vanity that Dr. King noted well over half a century ago. Much of America is comfortable with the idea that there are anthropological differences based on race. Many Americans seem at ease with the notion that all members of a race possess characteristics of the race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. And that is literally the Oxford Dictionary definition of racism. That notion, racial superiority, racism, is nonsense. It's not science, it's not logical. What it is an awful, false, hateful, cultural construct causing different access to fundamental rights based on skin color. Think about how ridiculous that is. It makes no more sense than my curly hair giving me access to rights and denying them to straight-haired people. Reverend Dr. King held that truth and love wins us up to the notion of racism, and he observed, quote, the idea of an inferior or superior race has been refuted by the best evidence in the science of anthropology. Great anthropologists agree that although there may be inferior and superior individuals within all races, there is no superior or inferior race. In the final analysis, the problem of race is not a political, but a moral issue. End quote. Racism is a moral issue. It is a Christian issue. And here's how the greatest American Christian minister to ever live, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, put it. Christianity repudiates racism. Numerous people in the North and South still believe that the affirmation, all men are created equal, means all white men are created equal. And we hear Dr. King's brilliance in those few words. He merges our secular and Christian moral compasses, and he shows that they point in the same direction, a desire for equal access to well-being for all. That's what all are created and endowed with rights. All are created equal and endowed with rights leads to. That's what love your neighbor as yourself and do to others what you want done to yourself leads to. That's the moral anchor for all religions and most nations. Christians, including Reverend King, call that anchor love. And Reverend King held up the love lens to show the way out of the hate and the violence of racism. He showed us the loving way of walking together toward equality, toward racial reconciliation. Love in our Bibles means the desire for the well-being of others. And Reverend Dr. King always urged love as the means to achieve equality and reconciliation. With love, he sought justice. And justice in the Bible means getting that which is due. And what is due everyone is what love desired, well-being. To put it secularly, everyone is entitled to equal access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the necessities of well-being. For whites, well-being in America includes access to quality education, employment and housing, fair and unfearful treatment by authorities and businesses, and having white children seen as children and their needs being of paramount community concern. That's not true. It's not true for non-whites and their children. Non-whites do not have an identical access to those things. Love and justice and fairness and access to well-being are biblical morals. But Reverend King made sure to point out secular equivalents. Our nation's claims that all are entitled to equality, to ensure liberty and justice for all. And Reverend King held up the unfiltered truth lens to show us the problem and hold us accountable. And he held up the love lens to give us hope and show us the way out. And those lenses show us that the injustice and unlovingness and immorality of racism begin with a lie that white is a higher-ranking skin color. A lie which leads to exclusive full access to rights. And consequently, being white has no detrimental effect on a white person's civil rights. But only white citizens have full access to the rights our nation promises to fully deliver to all its citizens. That is racism. But even well-meaning white discussions gently filter that horrid truth by calling it white privilege. Often whites hear that to mean elite entitlement. And they know the rights that they have are due everyone, so they ironically feel non-elite and not specially entitled, and they bristle at the notion of being elite, and they're correct. God-given rights are not a privilege to get or have access to. They are God-given. They are not a privilege to have and to hold. They are what is due to absolutely everyone. We point the unfiltered truth and love lenses of the Declaration of Independence, and we find these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those God-given rights are not our nation's promise to people or privilege some to hold. They are our nation's obligation to deliver to all of its citizens, not just those with white skin. Dr. King's point over and over and over again was that morally we are obligated by faith and law and love and truth to provide equal access to those rights. But there remains a prevalent white prejudice that ensures identical access to rights is for whites only. It's not white privilege, it's white failure at moral obligations. It's not white privilege, it's white lack love. It's not white privilege, it's white denial and deceit. It's not white privilege, it's an unloving moral sacrilege against our Creator's wishes and design and our nation's founding promises. Truth be told, racism's continuation in our nation is as un-Christian and un-American as it is unloving and unjust. There are whites who negatively respond in varying degrees to non-whites seeking and having identical access to the rights that whites have. And Dr. King called it white backlash. And he noted it was for the most part powered by petulance rather than principle. And we filter this truth by softening it, calling the spectrum of white people's negative responses white fragility. It's not about white fragility. It's about whites' unloving, petulant responses to our founding ideals that all citizens be provided equal access to God-given rights. It's about racism's notion of white superiority not being stopped and being played out and maintained. Many whites, like whites in charge, believe whites should be in charge, put whites in charge, and take steps to keep whites in charge. Many politicians and voters ignore our moral obligation and our nation's founding principle, giving them a backseat to god-awful, immoral, and unprincipled racism. It's not about white fragility. It's about whites who are power-hungry, jealous, protective, or just plain mean about sharing access to rights, and so respond with varying degrees of denial, distress, disrespect, anger, and violence. It's not about fragility. It's about selfishness. It's about lack of. Biblically, we would call it hard-heartedness. The truth we must face is that white citizens are provided access to everyone's God-given rights, but a good many of those citizens are hard-hearted about even discussing, let alone making sure we provide the same equal access to everyone. This has to stop. Reconciliation of the races begins, and racism ends when white Americans who perpetuate and benefit from racism stop it. Stop it by becoming better informed, educating ourselves and others about racism. Stop it by acknowledging racism exists, it's awful, and that we are a part of it. Stop it by acknowledging our mistakes and then working to fix them. Stop it by going out of the way to get to know and befriend people who have different skin color than our own. Stop it by listening to people of color, validating their experiences of racism and amplifying their voices so others listen. Stop it by standing up and opposing racism when we see it. Stop it by never honoring symbols of racism or the men who made their faith supporting it. Stop it by supporting those working to overcome racism. Stop it by grasping the idea that if all lives matter, then Black Lives Matter is ipso facto a truth, and we need to act like it. We can stop racism by actively taking steps and joining the walk toward equality and racial reconciliation. Martin Luther King Jr. stoked love. He gave hope. He aimed us toward peace and reconciliation. And he based his effort on both our nation's and our religious sacred words, which are truth and love lenses. Reverend King had a remarkable gift for making us face truth and love. His brilliant thoughts and words, his powerful voice, his peaceful action, his courageous life, and the truth and love he showed us dynamically resonate still. Dr. King can still make his turn and face truth and love. And any thoughtful American willing to turn and face truth and love has to admit the morally repugnant evil of racism exists and must grab our obligation to make it a priority to end its existence and redress all the harms that is caused to our fellow Americans. All thoughtful Americans must join God's rainbow color of people on the walk toward equality so that one day all will have identical access to the rights that whites presently enjoy. The purpose of the walk, to quote Reverend Dr. King, is that this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And that is, of course, how the famous dream part of I Have a Dream speech begins. There's a part of that amazing speech that we often overlook. It occurs not long before Dr. King begins that magnificent, soaring, poetic words that outline the dream most of us recognize. This part earlier starts with Dr. King noting the loving truth that white people's destiny is tied up with black people's destiny, that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom, and that we cannot walk alone. And then Dr. King details the loving walk we must take hand in hand to reach the reconciliation of the races, that beautiful dream that he describes. I'm going to close by reading aloud that short, powerful, earlier part of Dr. King's speech, his walking to reconciliation words. And And as we hear them, keep in mind, we must take this walk together. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors and police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. May we talk the talk and walk the walk so that